been gone to Bible camp this last week, and amidst the discussion going on in Washington about the debt ceiling, it doesn't interest me except in the fact that Washington is not Las Vegas. What happens in Washington doesn't stay in Washington. It hits like a ripple effect through the rest of the country. So what I do worry about is higher unemployment. People not being able to get jobs, or better jobs, where they can pay for their own needs and help out those who need it. I worry about what's going on overseas. We have connections, directly or indirectly, with what is going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. I worry about what is the potential for going on in other places in the Middle East. What happens if Iran gets a nuclear weapon and they decide to drop it on Israel? What happens if North Korea develops a nuclear weapon and they sell it to Al-Qaeda and they figure out a way to smuggle it into the United States? You might worry about some of those things too. We worry about things that are going on in our own lives. How the economy is going to affect us personally. Or maybe health problems that we have, or family members have, our neighbors have. And we have a long list of people on our prayer list who are dealing with chronic illnesses. Last week the lesson was on living in a Martha world and trying to have a Mary heart. The tension that we feel inside of us and trying to take care of physical needs while at the same time having a spiritual mind. That's not always easy. This lesson this morning is also about that same tension, the tension that we feel living in a physical world, a physical nation, but also being members of a spiritual nation, a spiritual kingdom. Living in the kingdom now in this life, and yet also realizing that this life is not all that there is a kingdom that is coming. And so this morning I want to talk about that theme that runs through the whole Bible, the theme of God's rule in man's world. Who is in charge? Sometimes we ask. Who is in control? Sometimes we think even in our own lives, I'd like to stop this merry-go-round and get off. Who is in control? God, of course, is in control. The subject of the kingdom throughout the Bible pictures the rule of God. The kingdom pictures God's reign. God is in control. Several times in the books of poetry, Psalms especially, and in the prophets, the picture is of God in control of the whole universe. God rules in the affairs of men. The rule of God was established in a very real way in man's world with the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel was God's kingdom in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 15, when the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt and crossed over the Red Sea, Miriam leads the Israelites in song, and they sing that Jehovah God lives and reigns forever. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, the Israelites are assembled around Mount Sinai, and they received the law through Moses, the Ten Commandments, and so forth. And God tells them that I brought you out of Egypt, on the wings of eagles, and I am making you a kingdom of priests. Israel was created as a nation, as a kingdom, in a very special way for God to reveal His rule among man in man's world. So that Israel and other nations around them would see the power of God and the wisdom of God and the plan of God. That is the reason why God chose Israel to be the manifestation of His reign in man's world. And later on, in the book of Judges, chapter 8, verse 23 specifically, Gideon is the judge there, and he delivers the Israelites from the hands of their enemies, the Midianites. And the Israelites want to make Gideon a king. And Gideon says, no, I will not be your king, and my son will not be your king. The Lord rules over you. The reign of God. God rules. Isaiah refers to God as the King of Jacob, the nation of Israel. God wanted the Israelites to enjoy the blessings of being the king's children. The king in Israel is pictured on one hand as being God's anointed. For example, when David had the opportunity to kill King Saul, because King Saul wanted in fact to kill David, David says, "How can I raise my hand against the Lord's anointed?" The king in Israel was pictured as God's anointed. The king was also pictured as God's son, and that's an interesting picture. The rest of the Israelites did not have that relationship with God, calling God Father. The king did. The king was pictured as the Son of God, having a special relationship with God. Other religions at that time, other nations at that time, pictured the king as being God. Israel pictured the king as being the Son of God, placed there on the throne for special purposes, to rule God's people in a fair and a just and a loving way, to feel the blessings of being the king's children. As we all know, the Israelites did not live up to God's expectations. It was not possible under that law for God to have the relationship with the people that He wanted to have, not because it was God's fault, because it was man's fault. It was a relationship that was, from man's perspective, more based on the flesh than on the heart. A few weeks ago, we looked at Colossians chapter 2, where Paul talks about being circumcised in the heart. The Israelites were circumcised in the flesh, and to them, that was the extent of their obligation to God. They never tried to have a relationship with God. And so the prophets especially come along, and they picture Israel being the kingdom of God, and yet there is a kingdom that is to come. They lived in the kingdom of God at the time, but they were not yet members of the kingdom of God. The Old Testament prophets come along, and they picture the kingdom being established. And in this new kingdom, the law of God is going to be written on man's hearts. And man was going to be circumcised in the heart. And man was going to enjoy the forgiveness of sins, and he's going to enjoy a special relationship with the King of the universe, the sovereign of the universe. The prophets picture the kingdom that was to come as being a spiritual kingdom. Isaiah pictures in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6 that a child shall lead this new kingdom, and on his shoulders shall be the kingdom of David. The kingdom that is to come. Jesus comes along. And we see in the life of Jesus, during the 3 years or so that Jesus preached, the idea that the kingdom is here, but the kingdom is not yet. God reigns in the hearts and the minds of people right now, but there is also a sense in which the kingdom is not yet here. In Matthew chapter 4 and verse 17, for example, and the kingdom is the substance of Jesus' preaching during his 3 years. And in Matthew 4 and verse 17, Jesus says that the time is at hand. The kingdom of God is near. The kingdom that the prophets had preached was coming, and for 400 years, from the end of the Old Testament until the beginning of the New Testament, the Israelites were waiting for the coming of that kingdom. The kingdom when God would have a special relationship with His people Israel. God would reign in their hearts in a very special way, and they would enjoy these blessings that the prophets talked about. Jesus comes along and He says, the time is near. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is about to break in again into man's world in a very special way. In a miraculous way, God created the nation of Israel. He brought them through the Red Sea on dry land. He assembled them around Mount Sinai, and He spoke to them with all the thunder and the lightning going on, all of the plagues that God had miraculously brought on the nation of Egypt. God had created Israel in the midst of miracles. And Jesus says God is going to do the same thing when He breaks in again into man's world with this new kingdom. But Jesus has a lot to teach His disciples about the nature of that kingdom. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 28, Jesus has cast an evil spirit out of a man, a demon out of a man. And Jesus tells His disciples and the Pharisees, the religious leaders that are assembled around Him at that time, Jesus says, if I, by the magicians recognized that the God of Israel had brought the frogs, the plague of frogs, on the Egyptians with his finger. And so Jesus says, now on this occasion, if I by the finger of God cast these evil spirits out, then know that the kingdom of God has come. Jesus wants his audience to understand the nature of this kingdom. And so in Matthew chapter 18, for example, Jesus is teaching and some little children want to come to him. The parents want him to lay his hands on them and bless them. And the disciples say, no, get away. Jesus doesn't have time for children. And Jesus rebukes his disciples and he says, the little children want to come to me. Do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus tells his disciples and others there that if you want to have this special relationship with God and this special kingdom, this special nation, this special group of people that belong to God, then you've got to have the humility of a child. You've got to want to come to Jesus Christ as a child. In Luke chapter 17, the Pharisees were asking Jesus, show us a sign when this kingdom comes. Now they're thinking a physical kingdom. In fact, the apostles are still thinking in terms of the physical, the literal, the here and now. And so in Luke 17, the Pharisees asked Jesus, show us a sign that we will know when the kingdom comes. And Jesus says, there's not going to be a sign because the kingdom of heaven is within you. The nature of the kingdom is interior. It's a spiritual nation. It's a spiritual relationship with God. Again, it is not a nation that is defined in physical terms like circumcision was for the nation of Israel. It's defined in spiritual terms, having that spiritual circumcision of the heart. Now, Jesus also points out in his life and his ministry that he is God's anointed. The Hebrew word is Messiah, and the Greek word is Christ. He is God's anointed. He is God's king. He is God's son. In a special way that the king of Israel was not. Jesus is God's son not because he made him God's son, but because he is intrinsically and inherently God's son. And so, for example, Matthew quotes Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, when little baby Jesus was in Egypt, when Joseph and Mary had to flee because King Herod wanted to kill all the babies. Matthew quotes Hosea 11, verse 1. He says, out of Egypt have I called my what? Son. Jesus fulfilled that responsibility of being a child of God that the children of Israel did not fulfill. All of the expectations that the sovereign Lord of the universe had on individuals, Jesus fulfilled. He was God's anointed. He was God's son. But even in the life of Jesus, Jesus says the kingdom is here, but the kingdom is not yet here. But the kingdom is at hand. Turn to Mark chapter 9 and verse 1. And notice in this text where Jesus tells his disciples that the kingdom that the prophets had predicted was coming, the kingdom about which Jesus preached for 3 years, that kingdom is almost here. The kingdom, Jesus said, is going to appear in your lifetime. Mark chapter 9, verse 1. Jesus said to his disciples, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste of death until they see the kingdom of God come with power. The rule of God in the life of man, Jesus says, is almost here. The reign of God in man's world is almost here. It has been here in one sense through the nation of Israel, but that was a physical kingdom. Now it's going to be a spiritual kingdom based on spiritual realities with a spiritual relationship. And Jesus says, some of you will not die until you see that kingdom established with power. With power. That's a key word in that text. Look over at Luke chapter 24, verse 49.